We're very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Dr. Deborah Davis. Dr. Deborah Davis is professor of epidemiology at the University of Pittsburgh Graduate School at Public Health, visiting professor at Carnegie Mellon University's Heinz School, honorary professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and expert advisor to the World Health Organization. She heads up the U.S.'s first Center for Environmental Oncology at the University of Pittsburgh Cancer Institute, and she is the author of more than 170 scientific publications. She is the author of the book When Smoke Ran Like Water, Tales of Environmental Deception and the Battle Against Pollution, and she is here to talk about her new book, The Secret History of the War on Cancer. If we could begin, start out and tell us, what was your motivation in writing your book, The Secret History of the War on Cancer?
Well, I began to become aware that cancer patterns were changing. We now have 10 million cancer survivors, but we are seeing more and more new cases of cancer in people that have nothing to do with smoking or aging. And no matter how efficient we become in processing sick people, and we have improved dramatically our ability to do that, if we don't figure out how to prevent new cases from occurring or prevent recurrences, we will have lost the effort. We've basically started out the war on cancer fighting the wrong war with the wrong weapons against the wrong enemies because we focused only on finding the disease and treating it, and not on the things that were known to cause it.
So when did the war on cancer officially begin?
It was officially launched by President Nixon in 1971. You have to remember what was happening in the world at the time. The U.S. was not doing very well at a military war that was fighting in Southeast Asia. The president had been assured that in 10 years, from 1971, we would have eradicated the disease. We would have figured out how to conquer cancer. And he wanted to win one because he was losing otherwise. In fact, there were many impulses for many years of people who recognized that cancer is a much more complicated thing than simply one disease. It's many different diseases with many different causes, depending on what timing of exposure, et cetera. But the president had been advised by his political advisors that this would be a good one to go for. And some of his advisors, of course, worked directly for the tobacco industry and the chemical industry, and they were the same leaders of the American Cancer Society at that time. One of the things I was surprised to find out is that the first head of the American Cancer Society, Clarence Cook Little, resigned in 1954 to take on a better-paying job as scientific director of the Tobacco Industry Research Council.
So it sounds like there was a little revolving door going here.
There was, and there still is. Unfortunately, senior officials of the National Cancer Institute, until recently, have gone to work for example, the soft drink industry, the people who bring us aspartame and NutraSweet. It's a pretty complicated situation, and there's no incentive now. There's no real neutral forum where we can get independent information. Our ability to get independent information has become narrowed and narrowed. Right now, for example, the federal government is spending less money on research on the environment and health than it ever has in its history, adjusted for inflation. And the government is testing fewer chemicals to see whether or not they are dangerous for our health than it ever has before. The Consumer Product Safety Commission doesn't have the authority and doesn't have the staff to monitor whether or not we're bringing in contaminated toys from China, for example, or contaminated toothpaste or shampoos, because they don't have the authority, they don't have the money, and it's not been a priority of this administration. Now, I'm very encouraged by the response of the public to my new book, The Secret History of the War on Cancer, because they understand this is unacceptable.
So is it your impression when they sold Nixon the idea that they could wipe out cancer in 10 years that they knew that, that wasn't going to happen?
Well, to say they knew implies a really active conspiracy. I don't think it was as simple as that. I just think that when in politics, the convenient is what is expedient. And it was very convenient to create this idea. After all, we'd put a man on the moon, we took technology off the shelf, in that case from engineering, and we were able to do something remarkable. Why shouldn't we have been able to do this with the same can-do enthusiasm that America brought to so many enterprises?
So in your research, when did they start really looking into cancer itself and, for instance, like where it was showing up in the workplace?
Well, actually, that story is well over several hundred years old. Some of the earliest observations of the fact that workers had higher risks of cancer were really made by Hippocrates, who found that there were cancers in certain situations that they couldn't otherwise explain. Cancer was a rare disease back then. Ramazzini in the 16th century, 17th century, actually documented that certain trades had higher risks of cancer. Now, moving ahead, by 1936, I was astonished to find in the modern era that the world's leading cancer scientists understood that hormones cause cancer, that sunlight caused cancer, that diagnostic radiation could cause cancer, that coal tars cause cancer. They knew that in 1936 because the kind of evidence that scientists used in those days was a combination of experimental studies in animals plus observations of humans. Around the time that the war is winding down, World War II is winding down, there comes a real big split in what is considered evidence regarding causes of cancer in humans. At that point, a big, bold barrier is erected, and it's thought and argued that the only proof of human harm from environmental hazards is enough sick or dead people. That, I think, has been a fundamental flaw in public policy today, because now you have a situation where the only way you can say that something causes cancer in humans is if you have shown it to already have happened. Now think about this. Most cancer can take 10, 20, 30, 40 years to occur. If you're saying that you have to prove it has already happened first, you're basically dooming 1 or 2 generations to a fate of cancer that you would be able to prevent. Now, if we had paid attention to the approach taken by the world's cancer scientists in 1936, we would not be doing that.
Talk about some of the people that were working on the issue of cancer back then. I believe one of the gentlemen was a guy named Hüppner. Is that right?
Hooper.
Sorry.
Wilhelm Hooper was a researcher in Germany. I want to correct something that I said. I made a mistake. Hippocrates didn't clearly associate cancer with professions. That was done more by Ramazzini. Hippocrates, however, did observe cancer and did observe that you could cut out breast cancer with fire, which is a tool very similar to, unfortunately, what we still do today. But as to Wilhelm Hooper and the Nazi story, it is very interesting to realize that the Germans were among the leaders in scientific research understanding the environmental causes of cancer, and that they had a whole program to try to limit known and suspected causes of cancer. They had a program to try to ban smoking in public places and to limit and actually put penalties against women who were found to smoke, especially because Aryan women were supposed to be charged with producing the master race. But the Germans were not alone in understanding environmental causes of cancer, because in the 1930s, the Italians, the Swiss, and by the late 1930s, the English had all taken action to identify asbestos as a cause of poor health and cancer in workers as well. The United States didn't do that until the 1970s.
And Hooper, he was involved with the first development of unleaded gas is interesting, because I believe in your book you point out that some of the first people working with that died from their work.
Absolutely. The place they worked was known as the House of Butterflies, because people would go mad from exposures to this tiny amount of liquid neurotoxin, lead, that was put into gasoline. So Robert Kehoe was brought in as a young industrial hygienist, a physician, and he figured out correctly that if you protected people from these fumes, they wouldn't die, and you could safely put lead into gasoline, which would boost the octane. The sad story here is that the Ethel Corporation, which was then owned in part by Standard Oil, gave the formula for leaded gasoline to the Nazis, to the fascists in Italy, and to the Japanese. And I have in my files and posted on my website for my book, The Secret History of the War on Cancer, documents showing that Robert Kehoe assured the safety of the German, Italian, and Japanese workers to produce lead in gasoline. I also have documents from the War Department ordering the Ethel Corporation not to give the formula to these countries, recognizing its importance for fighting the war effort. They formed a company called Ethel Gemeinschaft despite the War Department's orders. And after the war, in the records that I have in my book, The Secret History of the War on Cancer, the Germans acknowledged that without lead in gasoline, they would not have been able to fight us, to kill so many American GIs. So we basically, some American corporations, gave the formula for leaded gasoline to the Germans, Italians, and Japanese that they then used to fight our soldiers.
Kehoe is a very interesting character. He almost seems like a poster child for people working behind the scenes on this issue. In addition, you point out in your book that he was with the U.S. Army, is that right?
He was with the Office of the OSS. And after the war ended, after our war with Germany ended in June of 1945, he goes over to Germany as part of a group, and he interviews people there, including the man who headed up Germany's development of poison gas research and toxic chemical development and pesticides. And he interviews that man, Fleury, and has incredibly detailed materials from the archives, because German science, until Hitler, had been #1 in the world. German was the language of science in the 1930s. Most scientists had to study German and spoke it and could read it, certainly. And many major publications appeared in the German language. Hitler, of course, destroyed first what he called Jewish physics and then the rest of science. But with respect to chemical research, there was phenomenally advanced and sophisticated chemical research that was carried out by the Germans throughout the war. They developed the world's first institute for research on tobacco hazards at Jena. And they showed clearly that tobacco caused an increase in lung cancer. But they also did field studies on poison gas, seeing what happened when they exposed people to poison gas. And Ferdinand Fleury was the leader of this work. And Kehoe interviews him, and in his notebooks, which I found in the archives at the University of Cincinnati, there's some admiration for the science, which is understandable as a scientist. It was very impressive work. Of course, thinking as someone who lost family members to that conflict, it's hard to sort of reconcile the two things. Even his description of going through the camps, which he did then, and his description there seems somewhat clinically detached, the way he talks about what he refers to as the guest workers. These weren't guest workers, these were concentration camp prisoners. And just the language, the metaphors that one uses to describe all of this are quite astonishing. But I think that Kehoe was part of a culture that at the time assumed that properly informed, big business would make the right decision.
What happened to him after the war?
Oh, he went on to have a very illustrious career. He was the founder of industrial hygiene. He trained some of the best and brightest people in the field. And there are buildings named after him now. His work on lead was the most highly regarded at the time. Years and years later, people realized that his claim that levels of lead in the natural environment were high was based on contamination of his samples. And when Claire Patterson, a geophysicist at California, pointed out that in the pristine environment of the Himalayas there was no lead, there were efforts to try to discredit Claire Patterson by the Ethel Company and others. But ultimately, I think today people understand that Patterson was correct and Kehoe was mistaken. Now, I don't know, and I will never know, whether Kehoe ever understood how fundamentally flawed his work was. I don't think he did. I really do think this was a case of someone believing that he knew better than others. There is this arrogance that comes with many of us in science. We have a lot to be humble about. We know that there's a lot we don't know. But people generally believed, Kehoe believed, and in some sense Hooper believed, that if you could just get people the right information, that would be enough to drive the decisions in the right direction.
Another person I'm hoping we can touch on just briefly is Donald Rumsfeld, former Secretary of Defense, and his connection with aspartame.
Well, that's a kind of unusual and somewhat surprising connection. Not too many people realize that originally the data provided on aspartame, which is NutraSweet for its safety, were quite suspect. And they were so suspect that in January of 1977, the FDA's chief counsel, Richard Merrill, made agency history. He actually asked the U.S. Attorney's Office to convene a grand jury to decide whether to indict the major producer of aspartame, then G.D. Searle, for knowingly misrepresenting, quote, findings, concealing material facts, and making false statements on aspartame safety tests. And that's pretty astonishing. Well, the fact that that investigation never really happened tells us really a lot about the process by which information is developed on safety of drugs that are of great financial importance today. What happened was that the company hired Donald Rumsfeld just after he left office as defense secretary, shortly after the proposed investigation was announced, right? This is during the Carter administration. They announced the investigation. These investigations take a long time. Well, that July, the chief attorney who was in charge of the grand jury, Samuel Skinner, resigns and goes to work for Sidley and Austin, the law firm representing Searle. Eventually, William Conlin would join Skinner at the same firm. So the guys who were leading the grand jury investigation move over to work for Searle Company themselves. What happened after that was that things drag on and on and on. And, of course, we have the Reagan Revolution starting. And on January 22nd, 1981, there's been no development, no grand jury has proceeded. And we have a new president. The day after Reagan's inauguration, the Searle Company files for approval of aspartame. They've developed some additional information, not a whole lot. And 5 months later, the drug is approved.
So I guess we draw our own conclusions on that.
Well, you know, the truth is we don't have good information about things like this because we've stopped collecting it. I would remind you that in the Clinton administration, aspartame NutraSweet got approved very broadly. We often saw President Clinton with his can of Diet Coke. There is no evidence that NutraSweet actually helps you lose weight, by the way. And there is lots of reason for concern, including a very recent study that I referred to in my book, The Secret History of the War on Cancer, that just came out of Italy, where the researchers from the European Ramazzini Foundation in Bologna have found that consuming enough aspartame that you might get from 2 cans of diet soda and 2 yogurts and a diet custard or a couple sticks of gum a day could give you cancer if you live into your 60s, 70s, and 80s. And that's what I'm really concerned about. You see, animal tests that we use generally let animals live 2 years. If you let animals live 3 years, you're ending up with a better approximation of what the human lifetime is like. Many of us, myself included, hope to get into our 70s, 80s, and 90s. And children today who are using aspartame are the ones I'm concerned about. Because this study took baby rodents and let them live their natural lifetimes, and that was only in the 3rd year that the tumors developed. I want to make an observation, if I may, about this whole approach. You know, the Gates Foundation is famous, deservedly so, for pushing immunization and saving lives around the world, and they've had a tremendous impact on doing that. But no matter how many lives you may save with immunization, if you put children into a dirty environment with dirty water and dirty air, which are still is killing millions of children in the developing world today, what you're doing is really making this world safe for those who can afford to get the drugs to treat them for the diseases that they're going to get because of that dirty environment. So what I hope that Gates and others will soon be able to understand is that they've got to pay attention to primary prevention. Immunization is very important and life-saving. But if you don't also address the underlying environment around there, you're really missing an important opportunity, and ultimately you're making the world safe for pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, I was very happy to see your book dealing with, we always hear about, you know, the race for the cure for cancer as opposed to dealing with prevention. And of course, you look at the actual sources of that cancer. So would it be safe to say that in general, these larger corporations have pretty much pushed aside or put in drawers tests that would have shown that their different products are toxic?
Well, you know, I don't know that. I have in my book the files from the chief of toxicology for Mobil Oil, who clearly shared with me information when he got fired by them, by the way, and he won his lawsuit for wrongful termination. He shared with me clear evidence that Mobil had suppressed information about the dangers of benzene and gasoline. There's no question about that. But nowadays, I'm really quite encouraged by the growth of green businesses in some of the Fortune 10 and 50 companies as well. Archer Daniels Midland now has a whole group that's making bioplastics, where they're taking what is really agricultural waste and turning it into plastic. And I think that's very different, by the way, than growing corn to make fuel, which I think is very problematic. But taking things that would be garbage and turning it into other products, that's the wave of the future. The fastest growing sector right now in the business world is greening. And not just greenwashing, making companies look and feel like they're green, but actually turning things into saving energy, reducing waste, and increasing efficiency. And that sector is growing by 20%, whether it's in building and construction or retrofits, or even in fashion, where green is the new black. People are demanding safer, cleaner, and healthier products. And as a result, I think we're going to see the business community, instead of fighting this, understanding that this train is moving the station and they want to get on the train and off the tracks.
Do you have a sense for the areas where we are most impacted by cancer-causing agents in our lives? Would it be like food or things that we bring into the home, or what?
Well, people can understand that food is medicine, just as Hippocrates said more than 2,000 years ago. And so food is important, and it's the goods and the bads of food. We know that the more animal fat in your diet, the greater your risk of a number of diseases, including cardiac disease. But we know that fat has two things that it does. It accumulates in the body, but it also attracts a lot of the lipophilic organochlorine and other toxic materials. Fat has been called a natural hazardous waste site. So the more fat in your diet, the more toxicants you can take in. And a diet that's rich in fresh fruits and vegetables is going to be much more important for your health. And avoiding diets that are high in animal fat, that's very clearly established. In addition, the things that we come into contact with daily, the things we put on our bodies that we use to clean our homes, those can have an effect on our health. But air pollution and water pollution, things that we think we have no control over, are extremely important. In the developing world, water pollution is one of the most tragic and important things to control as a cause of poor health. And there's a recent book I would recommend to all of your listeners by Robert D. Morris here in Seattle called The Blue Death. And it does an excellent job of explaining why we need to rethink the way we control water in our areas as well as throughout the world today. Air pollution is one of these quiet issues which we don't think about because you have to breathe in order to live, and you don't have any ability to say no to breathing. But we know that when you're sitting in traffic waiting for cars to move through, even in downtown Seattle, you're inhaling pollutants inside your car that can be 10 times greater than those outdoors. So we need to see public transportation improved so that we have less air pollution generated by what we do with the vehicles and the way we transport ourselves. There are a couple other hidden risks that people don't realize, and one of them has to do with diagnostic radiation, particularly in children. When I was finishing my book, I was really pleased to see the American College of Radiology issue a white paper warning against unnecessary use of diagnostic radiation. Most people don't realize that a CT scan of the head of a young child can be between 200 and 6,000 chest x-rays, a single CT scan. Now, if a baby has a bleeding head, you may need to do that because it's a life or death situation. But many uses of CT scans are not for emergencies, and they should be reserved for really emergency situations, and they are not. And the amount of CT scans that we're getting today in the United States in the past 10 years has grown more than 5-fold. So the American College of Radiology is issuing a warning about this and calling for meetings with the ER physicians, emergency room physicians, who tend to order these tests and are unaware of their risks. What I think we also need is that every individual should have a permanent record of all of their diagnostic radiation, which will allow physicians to understand whether they've been exposed at a point where they should not be getting any more such tests without there being a life or death situation involved. Let me be clear, CT scans can save lives if you face a medical emergency, but they are increasingly being used in trivial ways. For example, these shopping malls where you can go and get a whole body scan. I think that's a very bad idea.
What positive signs have you seen out there? What are people doing that have inspired you?
Well, our University of Pittsburgh Medical Center is setting the stage for a green revolution in healthcare. We are getting rid of toxic products. We're shifting to cleaner things. We're using microfiber mops. Now, you might ask what that has to do with cancer. A microfiber mop can use half as much water, a third as much chemicals. You translate that into a large institution. We are more than 400 different buildings throughout the United States, as well as Ireland and Italy, and even in Qatar. And that becomes a major savings of energy to heat the water and savings for people to move things around, for mops for our workers and other things. So I think that what I'm encouraged by is the greening of the business world. And I think that's something which we want to continue to see develop. The Equator Principles have recently been adopted by Citigroup and a number of Fortune 10 companies. And this basically says we are not investing in businesses that are going to be degrading the environment. Now, it's rhetoric, but I want to see more and more companies walk the talk. And I'm encouraged that that's happening right now. And more information on this can be obtained from our website, preventingcancernow.org.
And briefly, you were telling me before we went on about an effort to influence women since they are the primary purchasers.
Girlcots are happening. Boycotts mean no. Girlcots mean yes. Women are mostly responsible throughout the world for the products that come into their homes that get fed to their children and put and used on their bodies. And more women are demanding that they want a market of greener, healthier, cleaner products that they can use and choose among. And that's happening here in Seattle. It's happening in your co-ops. It's happening at Trader Joe's. It's happening in lots of places around the country today. And I'm very pleased to see it because it's signaling that there is a sea change here. People understand that we've got to be smarter about not using things that are suspected hazards in our homes and not insisting that the only proof of harm that we will allow ourselves to act upon is when people are already sick.
All right. Well, with that, we're unfortunately out of time. So I want to thank you very much for coming in this morning.
Thank you so much.
Just been talking with Dr. Deborah Davis. She is author of the new book, The Secret History of the War on Cancer.